Hello everyone, I'm Pastor Randy Orwig here at Elon Community Church, and I'm with one of our illustrious church members. This is Katherine Floyd. Many of you remember her husband Emmett Floyd, who was also a member here for many years. After his retirement, he was also a United Church of Christ pastor, a conference minister, and also an admiral, a rear admiral in the Navy. So he had quite a bit of things. But Katherine, you yourself have had quite a history together. The reason I'm bringing you here today is I want to ask you a few questions about an issue that has become very timely, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement has created a great deal of marches and activities and calls for change. It's reminiscent of the 1960s when, and the 50s when the civil rights movement was trying to get the vote and other things. And I thought it was important for you to weigh in and to talk a little bit from your experience, as well as maybe some of the things about how you feel about this present time as well. So my first question to you, Katherine, is why was it important for you and Emmett in your relationship to be involved in the civil rights movement, and why did that mean something to you, and why was it important to do it?
Well, I grew up in Georgia, a small southern town, and even beyond that I grew up in the country because we needed to live near water for my father's canning business that he was trying to get started. We have always been a religious family, church-oriented family. And I went to Sunday school for my earliest years, and I continued. I think it was during some of the experiences of my childhood, there were many blacks who lived in little shacks, in the neighboring area where I lived. I guess they were called sharecroppers then. And I got acquainted. We always had a cook in our kitchens. We had women who came in to clean up. We had men who came in to start fires for us in the fireplaces in the morning. I've had a close association with blacks around me all my life. And they have all been good experiences. But when I started school, I had to ride the bus from out in the county into the city to go to school. And it disturbed me that when we would be riding along in the bus, here was a group of black children who were coming down the road, going to their schoolhouse. And I wondered, why is it that we have a bus to take us and they don't have a bus to take them? So there were things that would come up. I know that when one of the men who worked at the canning plant for my father, when he died, my father and the men around him brought his body up to the house, to our house, and my father went to get his wife and bring her to the scene. And they asked my father to conduct the funeral for him at the neighboring black church. And I went with him. I don't exactly know how that happened, but I went with him to the funeral. And I know that when the maid in our home had developed cancer to the point she could no longer work, my father and mother took me and took her up to Macon, Georgia, which was about 60 or 75 miles northeast, and took her to the Lady of Perpetual Care, a Catholic ministry for those that had nowhere to go. She had no family, she'd never married, no children. And so we took her for her last days there. So my mother and father cared for our neighbors, for the workers at the cannery, for the people who'd been a part of our family. We cared for them, all of their days. And then when I was in church all those days in the children's Girls Auxiliary, I read the book In His Steps by Philip Sheldon many years ago. I saw the movie The Road, and I was going to be the best Christian that anybody could be all those years. And when I went to college, I went to the Maine Baptist College in Georgia, Mercer University. And I had some wonderful experiences there. One of my classes was, one of my sociology classes, was conducted by a man who was an ordained Baptist preacher, but he also was a professor at the college. And the textbook that we used was one written by a Swiss man. He had been recruited by the Carnegie Foundation to come to America and observe our scene, particularly as it related to the blacks. And he was to look at it objectively and spend years investigating how the blacks in our society were treated. He was an economist, so that was his main goal, was looking at the economy of the whole country of the United States of America. And in his book, he wrote a book that was used as our textbook. And in that book, he talked about the contradiction of the way that we were using blacks in our society, as opposed to the principles of our founding fathers. He said that he saw this as the biggest problem. The American Dilemma was the name of his book. And he said that we had not admitted them into our society. We must begin to educate them. We must begin to give them the tools to create a life for themselves that would be satisfactory and good. And we must be allowing that to happen in our society. But he did not see that happening, and he felt that that was going to be a problem. He was a Swiss man. He didn't know anything about the South and what, we read about it. He looked at all the facts of how they worked in our society. And then he wrote this book with just the idea that we must provide a way for them to become part of the economy of our America. Or it would never work if we could not come to that resolution of what do we do about our relationship to the blacks. Well, then at Mercer, I met a young man whom my brother had gotten to know at an RA camp. And he was so impressed with this young man that he thought it'd be a good idea to mention it to me, because we were both going to wind up at Mercer. And so, when I met him, we didn't get together right off. But we began to join different organizations on the campus, and we began to have conversations. And I think we both felt like our generation had something to consider. I went to college in 1945. I think the end of the war was in May of 1945, maybe, perhaps. Okay, but Truman had integrated the military and the federal workforce. And I think we and a number of our friends, our age group, our generation, began to feel like this was handed to us now as something that we needed to do in our society. And I knew from my many years in this small town, there had been terrible things that had gone on. There was a lynching that was never in the papers and never in the courts, but it was a horrible mistreatment of a man who was a chauffeur and had a nice, beautiful black car where he took people places where they wanted to go. And he disappeared from the scene, and as the facts began to come out, it was horrible. And I'm sure this was not the first time it had happened. And so we knew that we had to begin to think about ways that we could operate. Well, when the Korean War came along, we had been in a pastorate in Chipley, Georgia, which is now part of Pine Mountain. It's a resort place, Callaway Gardens.
And at that time, Emmett became a Baptist minister.
Well, he grew up Baptist as I did. Oh, in his church, he was very active. He and a group of 2 or 3 friends were all going into the ministry.
Okay.
So he had strong feelings about his place and what he was going to do. His grandfather had been a representative to the government from, serving from a county in Georgia. And it was whether was he going to emulate his grandfather and become a lawyer, and go that route, or what was he going to do? So after we married, he worked for my father at the canning plant for the summer. And during that time, my pastor talked to him in terms of he could go to the seminary for free if he were going to become a pastor. And so, he offered that to him. And I'll recommend you, he said, and, that would be great. So for the few months that we were together there, after he had to make a decision, then he decided, yes, we'll go to the seminary. So we continued to go out on mission projects, from the church we joined in Louisville, Kentucky. And then he went to this church in Chipley as his first pastorate. But the Korean War was going on. He had signed up for the military chaplaincy while he was at seminary. That was an option that the seminary students had. And so he did sign up for that. So while we were in Chipley at this first pastorate, the word came that they would like to use more chaplains. Would he come? So we left that and he went to Korea for a year and spent a year there. 6 months before the war ended and 6 months after the peace treaty was signed. So then when he came back, the First Baptist Church in Decatur, Georgia, was hoping to start a new mission church because the suburbs are growing in around Atlanta, between Atlanta and Decatur. The veterans were coming home from service. They had gotten their college education, they had married, they were starting their families. And it was just a beautiful time to start a new church, to have all these young people with their young families getting together in a suburban church. So we started a Baptist church. It's very close to the United Church of Christ in Atlanta now.
Okay.
We also became members in later years. But anyhow, at that church, it must have been 1960. No, it must have been 1953 or 4, I guess.
Because it was right after the war. It was right after he got out of the military.
After he was out of the Korean War. We started a church in Decatur, and it just grew so fast. It just grew so big. He was given an award by the Chamber of Commerce in Atlanta, Georgia, as the Young Man of the Year, because of the growth of the church and what he had accomplished with that. We grew to about 800 members,
Wow.
in the 6 or 7 years that we were there. We had over 80 young children before first grade. We had a preschool plan for them going on at the church all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it also was the civil rights years as we moved into the later years. And there was a big decision about the sit-ins. The black young people were going to visit churches all over the city and sit in, make their presence known. And that was one of the ways they were going to start working on civil rights. And so we had a young board of deacons, but they were chaired by an older man. And when the time came for us to think about how we were going to accept them if they came to sit-ins, this old deacon, oh no, we can't have them come into our church.
Wow.
We don't allow blacks to come to our restaurants. We don't allow them coming anywhere. We can't allow them to come. And my husband tried to prevail upon him. Our doors are open. This is not our church. It's God's church. Anyone can come. Oh no, this is different. we have to have a resolution that, and vote on it. And my husband, during the interval of weeks, tried to dissuade him that we don't need to have a vote. We are open to anybody coming in. They're not coming in to harm us. It would be a good idea for us to invite them to come in and welcome them. But oh no. So he forced the Board of Deacons in to come up with a resolution that would not allow them to be seated. Well, when my husband found out that he was going to present that resolution regardless to the congregation, the Sunday that we had church, he was going to present it after the church service to the congregation. And my husband told him before that, he said, if you're going to do that, then I'm going to say what I think, So my husband had the first opportunity when he preached the sermon that morning. And he talked about his own experiences with blacks and how he had come to feel about blacks and what their place in our society should be. That after all, we're Christians who say that we love everyone. And so there was no question in his mind about how we would treat anyone else. So when the time came and my husband preached his sermon, and then the deacon came up to make his resolution, then we voted. And the vote was overwhelmingly to support my husband, in saying that the right thing to do would be to welcome them and accept them as they would anyone who came to visit our church.
Right.
But of course, you lose key people then who, when you draw a line in the sand, then you're going to, really cut it so dry that these people are for and these people are against.
Right.
And we stayed on for over a year and a half, living with the dichotomy that had been established there. And I think my husband realized that in the meantime, my husband had gotten acquainted with Reverend Jimmy Lightburn, who was the Southeast Conference minister of the United Church of Christ. And my husband had known about other denominations, of course, in his work as a chaplain, and he had respected and admired the other chaplains with whom he had worked. And when he talked with Jimmy Lightburn told him that the United Church of Christ was accepting black members. We were going to be jointly joined in the United Church of Christ. We were not going to have just a black, we had the Convention of the South, which was a black convention. They had merged with the white Southern Conference members who were from the 4 different backgrounds of churches.
Right.
And so the Congregationalists, the old Christian church, started by James Kelly, and the Reformed and the Evangelical.
Right.
Those 4 churches, which were mostly European background churches, they merged. And then the Convention of the South, which was a black convention only. And it had one man as its head, his supervisor. He lived in Greensboro. Dr. J. Stanley was his name.
Okay.
We met him when we came to Greensboro. But anyhow, when he learned that there was a denomination that would say that blacks should be equal to whites in their denomination, they should be fully accepted as members, then this sounded good to my husband. But he still would not have ordination in the
Gotcha. Right.
in the church. He could not immediately go to a UCC church from a Baptist church. So at that time, we were experiencing the missiles being moved into Cuba by the
So that would have been right around
by
1960s.
the Russians, yes. So they needed more chaplains to come back and be active in the military then. So what my husband decided was, well, he would go back into active military. He had been reserved. He would go back into the military, and he would serve then. So he was on a helicopter carrier, the Iwo Jima, floating around while Khrushchev and Bobby Kennedy were arguing and talking about how this was going to work
Right,
out.
how this was gonna work.
And he didn't know on board the ship. He said nobody knew whether they were going to go to war in a few minutes or what was going to happen.
Right.
And we back home knew nothing. And it was not in the news as we get the news so instantly now. This was not in the news and talked about it all.
Wow.
So as it worked out, of course, things were settled so that the missiles were removed, were no longer aimed at the United States of America, and the crisis was over. But he remained for his sign-up of 2 years' duty. And we were in Norfolk then following his base at the helicopter base in New River, which was adjacent to Lejeune.
Okay.
So then after he had finished his 2 years, we had to make a decision about where were we going to go. What was he going to do then if he wanted to get out of the military and go on reserve? He always maintained his reserve status, and that was why he became a rear admiral at the end, because he was always in charge of all of the reserve military.
I see.
So he met with billets from time to time. In addition to being a pastor, he maintained his military connections.
Okay.
So that, he was given the status of rear admiral at the end of his military career for his entire 20 plus years of service in the military. But when we came into, then at the end of his military, 2 years, a church came up to interview him from Reedsville, North Carolina. And he really did not feel that this was, did not respond. He did not feel like this was the place to go. So finally our first church in the UCC then was in Florida, at Windermere, which became the bedroom community of Disney World. It was not built at the time that we were there, but property was being bought up and nobody knew who was buying all this property.
Huh.
So we served the church there for 2 years, I believe it was. I can't always remember.
That's
all the
fine, but it wasn't a
chronology.
real long time, it was a few years. Okay.
And then we were invited to come to Greensboro for Emmett to become pastor of the Congregational United Church of Christ in Greensboro. So we came there in December, at the end of December in 1966. So he began 1967 at the Congregational Church in Greensboro. And I had started going, I knew that with 5 children, I probably was going to have to do something to help finance their going to college and all the good things that happen in a family. So I had finished my degree while we were at seminary, an elementary education degree. And I thought, well, I can add a master's degree onto that and become a counselor. So I began taking courses one at a time until I finished my degree. And at the time I finished my degree, the Greensboro Public Schools, which were not connected with Guilford County at that time, they were going to integrate the schools in the fall. And I think it may have been 1971 when they did their first integration of public schools, Greensboro City Schools. And I was added by additional funds to help with integration. Federal funds were added to help. So I was one of 3 counselors added to the system in Greensboro, ACOP Junior High it was. And I felt like this was a way for me to use the skills that I had learned, plus my caring about Black children and what was going to happen to them and how they should be treated in the school system. So over that summer, the Black church in Greensboro, which was pastored by Reverend George Gay, this St. Stephen's
Yes.
United Church of Christ.
Which
in
is still there.
Greensboro. Yes. My husband had become friends with the pastor, George Gay, And they talked about what we could do to help with the feelings about the blacks who were afraid and worried, and the whites were as well. So what they worked out was to set up teams of people who would go and visit with black couples, and then invite the black couples to come back to their homes in the city and visit with them, so we could get to know each other over the summer. So we had a number of different teams that was set up to visit back and forth with the black members, at St. Stephen's.
Was there any problems at the Congregational Church over that? Was it pretty supportive?
That was the Congregational Church in Greensboro was a very special church. It had been pastored for over 31 years by Dr. Wisserman. He came from a German background. He was a Methodist. But when he came to visit his sick father-in-law, his wife, Graham, they came to Greensboro to visit his father-in-law, who had been pastor of that church. If I'm remembering correctly, his name was Rowland, Dr. Rowland.
Okay.
But he was not going to be able to pastor, and Dr. Wisserman supplied for him a couple of times. And they liked him so much that they decided, we'll just call him as our next pastor then. So he had a Methodist background, and he had to watch his German closely.
Very heavy German accent.
Yes, still fighting the prejudice against Germans somewhat. But he became their pastor, and his wife had gone to, I believe, Chicago seminary and gotten a religious education degree. So she was wonderful in the way that she set up the education in the church, the religious education opportunities, and her two sisters joined her in their membership. And they had a beautiful, wonderful church. And Dr. Wisserman really became the pastor of Greensboro at large, I think. Everybody knew him and loved him. So after 31 years, he was retiring. And
so that was a perfect moment for Emmett.
Yes, except, we knew that people would never love us like they had loved the Wissermans. So Emmett must have been, 30, maybe he was 34 when we came to Greensboro. And so he was quite a different thing than the church had been dealing with before. I think he even had to set up the governing body of the church, because he and Graham they didn't need anybody else, they knew everything.
They did it all.
But this was going to be new to them. I think they were accepting, loving people to begin with. And so we didn't hear the negatives. I was so busy with my 5 children.
Right.
And going to school and then becoming a counselor. We didn't really tune in too much on the negatives. I know that people still loved the Wissermans, and we were glad for that. We wish that he had stayed in the church. But he was also pastoring some churches who needed a pastor out in the county.
In his retirement.
Yeah, he stayed busy all of his life.
Can I just stop you for a second here and just ask this question? While Emmett was still a Baptist pastor, I know that there were a couple situations where he signed a document. He was the only Baptist, I think you said he was the only Baptist pastor to do so, and that he had, on one or more occasions, had actually gotten up to speak at some of the Baptist conventions or the gatherings. Could you say anything about that, just a few things about those events?
Well, as I said, Emmett just felt so strongly about some things that he was not going to be quiet and silent. And we had friends that had felt the same way when we were in seminary and in college. But a pastor is rather limited by his congregation sometimes about what he can say and do when he's representing the church. But in Atlanta, the Baptist Pastors Conference, was a huge, group of people. And our governor at that time, Marvin Griffin, if I'm correct, I think I am, was governor, he was going to shut down the schools in Georgia, all of them, before he would integrate them. So my husband felt very strongly about this, and we've got to do something, he felt. So he got before, he told the, he talked to the people planning the program. He wanted a spot on the program to be able to say what he thought about what our voice should be with a governor who had declared he was going to shut down the schools.
Right.
So my husband asked for a few minutes on the platform to speak. And he told them what he wanted to do, what he wanted to introduce. And the older Baptist pastor who was pastor of Druid Hills Baptist Church, Dr. Louis D. Newton, was the voice of most Baptists
Right.
in Atlanta. And Emmett talked with him and told him what he was going to do. And of course, Dr. Newton said, "We agree with you, but you know it's not quite time, you know.
It's not time, yeah.
Not quite time for us to do anything like this. It's too upsetting to our congregations to do this." And Emmett said, "Well, I have a few friends here. We're all prepared to speak. We are asking that you do it yourself, being really someone who's respected and admired by everyone.
Right.
We're asking if you would present it to the group and tell them that you feel that this is a stand that the Baptists in Georgia should take." And Dr. Newton turned that down. And Emmett said, "Well, if you are not going to speak, then I'll request a place that I can speak." So he did. He presented it to the Georgia Baptist preachers who were there in their annual summer conference. And then
Obviously, there was to no avail. I mean, did they still vote against what he was saying, or did they?
I don't know whether it came to a, you know.
Oh, okay, I hear what you're
I
saying.
don't know.
But he had a chance to speak.
I don't know, but he had a chance to speak. Okay. But then he was presented, a Methodist pastor, Bevel Jones was his name. I don't know whether he was on the faculty at Candler Theology, but his degree was from Candler in Atlanta. And he started, let's put an ad in the Atlanta Constitution Journal paper. And so they rented out, you know, a big page for whoever who would sign up and say, you know, we must take a stand now. We cannot allow our public school system to be shut down. We must say that this is not the right way to go as pastors. And so they got, I believe it was 79 pastors in Atlanta who agreed to sign it. And my husband was the only Baptist who signed it. He and a young Presbyterian friend, between it, the two of them decided. I don't know whether they had to pay for it. I don't know who was paying for the ad.
Right.
But the newspaper editor, Ralph McGill, was always a very progressive man. Brilliant, wonderful person. And I'm sure the paper allowed maybe them to not have to pay as much for that ad. But they all signed the ad. And it was in the paper then, the Sunday paper. Wow. That the pastors in Atlanta, these pastors, do not think we should agree to what the governor is proposing, that we should say this is not right. Mm-hmm. And so...
did he ever get any kickback in his church for doing that?
I'm sure he did. He did not tell me, you know.
All the stuff that he had to go through.
He did not tell me all the ins and outs of everything.
Right.
And Emmett, you know, he would always say when somebody didn't like him or, you know, didn't speak kind words about him, he would just say, well, they don't know me. They're just, you know, this right. is, you know, he would not bother with people that wanted to fight about it.
Right.
He just was not that kind of a man.
Right.
And he didn't even fight with me.
That's a wonderful gift. You know, we're talking about the 1950s in the 1960s. I know that the pressure was big because it was really a first time that people were really, really dealing with this.
Yes.
Do you ever remember some of the pressure you felt in congregations when you were worshiping, or just the day-to-day existence in a church, especially when you were in the midst of the civil rights movement? Was there tension? It sounds like when you were in Greensboro, there was attempts to do constructive things.
Yes.
But you were at that Baptist church in Georgia, and there might have been a sense, you said there was kind of a divided kind of a feeling.
Well, they all joined the church. Emmett, what he said and the way that he presented it to people, it drew them in. These were young veterans that had experienced integration in the military forces. They had come in with, they were just a really great group to work with. And they liked my husband so much that I think that they just didn't feel like fighting about things. There were older members, yes, that wouldn't have agreed, at many points, yes, they did. But they had the opportunity, they could leave if they wished to. But they did not. Some of them wrote letters, oh yes, this is not God's church, it's Emmett Floyd's church, and
Right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. I've heard of some very interesting letters and read some over the years that you would wonder where they came from.
Well, as I said, he did not tell me everything, he did not show me all the letters, but
Right.
I could tell.
Right.
I could see and hear and realize. But I was caught up with my family, and I just I couldn't take everything. And Emmett did not take things personally. He didn't ever get really personally upset with people. We could understand their prejudices. It was all around us. But we felt like we had to do what we felt was the right thing to do. As ministers of all people, we should be concerned with how people are treated. I still go back to that textbook in college where Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist, telling America, you have a contradiction here in the way you handle the blacks who live amongst you. Until they are accepted into the main line, into the channel of education and of jobs, they can lift themselves out of poverty. They can become a part of wonderful America, as the whites have, who've come from different places in Europe and whatnot. And he said, you have to give them a chance, America. If you don't deal with this problem now, you see, it's always been pushed out. We won't deal with it now, And so it feels the same to me almost as the way it felt in Georgia, the way it felt in Atlanta in the civil rights days. People still have the same prejudices that they had. Not many people are able to get rid of that. But I think the only way you can, is to feel like we pray, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then we pray, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We're supposed to bring the kingdom of heaven within our hearts, and it's supposed to spread like the yeast in bread, grow like the mustard seed grows into a big tree. We should be living this way here on earth. The kingdom of God should be here with us. We should be working and living in the kingdom of God. And it should exist here on earth as it is in heaven. And we, the people who've responded to Jesus all these years, where are they when it comes down to saying, if we love God, then the next thing is, the first commandment was to love God with all your heart and mind and soul. And the second was to love others as yourself. So if we don't love others as ourselves, which means that we want the same good things for them as we want for ourselves. We want them to have schools. We want them to have houses. We want them to have neighborhoods like we have. So that is our commitment, I think.
Yeah.
And
Well, let me build off of that just for one more question. And that is, we're in 2020 now. Obviously, we're in a pandemic, so things are very different. Churches aren't gathering in person, but we know that there are people who are gathering on the streets. We know that there is a call and a new desire for change, that they want to actually change laws and do things like that. And it's under the moniker of this term Black Lives Matter, which has now turned into, for some, a position. In other words, of whether you're for or against Black Lives Matter, which has, once again, created a dichotomy. It's created these problems. In our community, there's an issue about a banner that's being done by local artists to write Black Lives Matter, and they want the banner to be displayed at different parts of the county. And we as a church have been called to be one of the displayers. In other words, that we might have it for a short period of time in our yard. Does it feel the same as it did back then? If we're having to answer this question, how would you respond to, what would you want to see happen? Would you want our church to be one of those people, or one of those groups that would stand up and allow for this notion of equality?
yes, I have been wondering, where is the church in all of this? Because for now several months, we have allowed the young people to march at night all over this country, blacks and whites and brown and every other mixed in color. They have been doing this at night. And while we have sat back in our homes and stayed out of not only the stores, but stayed out of our churches and stayed out of any mixing then and going and joining our voices. So we have really sat out this effort, to bring the communities together and to work on this issue of racism in our society. And I have wondered, where are the churches? Why isn't anyone speaking? Because when I have talked with several of my black friends, and they said, well, if you have seen the video of the policeman with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, if you don't feel something from that, if you don't feel that that was wrong and you don't want to do something about it, I can't understand. She said, we are looking for some response to that video. We think it may be the spark that will help to set many things right that have not been right. And it's not just the police force and how they operate. It's a general feeling towards blacks that many people still have and operate by. And I would like, to think that particularly the United Church of Christ, which is an integrated church, in our church women's group from this association, our conference, we meet with black women. We have one who's been our president for 4 years. She does an excellent job. I can't understand the problem, with having black people move along in society beside us, I don't know why we have been silent. I don't know why churches hesitate to say something about justice. Justice was something that the Jewish people talked about all the time. And I feel that that's what Martin Luther King was emphasizing in his speeches. Justice.
Right.
And I don't understand the silence. So I have felt just really glad that young people don't have the same prejudice that many of the older people do. And they can move together and they can understand the suffering of the black people, and they can use their ideas and how they live their lives. They can live that differently than we have. So I'm just hoping for a future like that. We have to do something to make things better.
Thank you so much. You've been a valuable resource today, and I hope that sharing this has given you some good memories of remembering, and also probably some mixed memories about what you had experienced during those years. But I truly appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, when I went to a meeting over at the Homes for Children, when they still operated the elementary school, I was invited to come and be part of that. Dr. Lambert was there also, and the faculty from the school was there. The officials at Elon's Home for Children were there. And at lunchtime, we moved around, went over to get our food and bring it back to the table. And a young black woman there said, "You look so familiar. I think I know you." And I said, "Well, I worked in Greensboro for a while. Where are you from?" And she said, "Well, I grew up in Greensboro." And she said, "I think you were my counselor." And she said, "You called me in and you showed me my test results on one of the standardized tests that we took. And you told me what this means when you're in the 85th percentile. That means you did as well as 85% of the students who took this test. That means you're able to go to college, you're able to get an education for yourself and do what you'd like to do." And she said, "That's the reason I'm here today. Because of what you said to me." And that was how I looked at my job as a counselor. These black children were coming into schools with the white children for the first time. At ACOP, we had a wonderful drama teacher who brought the black students in. Oh, they were great at doing drama, at singing, at dancing. We did mime, anti-mime. Oh, we did cats. That was a brilliant,
Yeah.
And the black and white children had a great time because they could get together on these things
Right.
and enjoy them, and the blacks could show you, we have talents too,
Right.
And I just felt like that was what my job was as a counselor, not only to help each child to do the best that they could do, and then to let the black children know how they measured up so that they could have some confidence in going to get higher education and moving themselves, out of housing, federal housing, and moving where they wanted to go.
Exactly.
So that, I enjoyed being a part of that. I thought it was just a God-given blessing to me
Amen.
that I could be in the counselor's office.
Amen. Katherine, thank you so much.